if you read Indian history, you find that long before the British came, the Indians were conquered from the northeast and from the northwest by Mongols, by Aryan hordes coming in from Europe, and that shapes their history. The influence of that varies depending on where you are in the country. Far to the south, the invaders never really penetrated very effectively. The Moguls were the most successful at that. And so you won't see so much influence there. But in the north, they were repeatedly invaded by different cultures. And that goes through their psyche. And so foreigners are viewed with a little suspicion, and particularly Western people, because most recently the British were the ones that sort of came in a commercial sense initially and then ended up taking over politically. So there's this cultural aspect of self-reliance, plus this cultural aspect that is long in their cultural memory of having been invaded, makes them treat foreigners with a little bit of distance.
Briefly, the British had controlled India by taxing the basics of life, just as they did with their American colonies tea, leading to the Boston Tea Party. In India, the British taxed salt. In addition, they rigidly enforced laws which required India to sell all the cotton she grew to British textile mills, which then had the exclusive monopoly to sell cotton fabrics back into India. A pretty neat setup from the British point of view, and one they held on to over many generations of Indian life, often against valiant but ultimately futile resistance against the sometimes brutal British military power, which was never far behind the perfumed illusion of the Raj. Then along came Mahatma Gandhi, who taught that any kind of forceful resistance to the British or to any oppressor was ineffective, and that the only effective strategy was nonviolence. He showed the Indian people how to use nonviolence as a tool against British oppression with two simple, dramatic acts. He led a crowd of Indian people onto the salt flats near the Indian Ocean, where, by the thousands and then by the tens of thousands, they made salt and carried it away to their homes in spite of beatings and some deaths at the hands of the infuriated but ultimately helpless British. Second, he showed Indians that they could use a simple, homemade spinning wheel to spin cotton from their own fields into a rough but serviceable cotton cloth for clothing and all other domestic purposes. Soon thousands, then tens of thousands, then millions of homemade spinning wheels were making cotton thread, and then on simple hand looms, the fabric was made, which brought British textile mills to a standstill within a very short time, precipitating the events which led directly to the British withdrawal from hundreds of years of power and privilege in India. So today, when, as an American business person, you think of India as a culture and as a market, think of India too as a place where people won their freedom from the same colonial power we did, a few hundred years later, and using a completely new, culturally distinct, and extremely powerful force. Keep in mind, too, that the symbol on the Indian flag is that same homemade spinning wheel, which the Indian people used to bring down the British Empire, as surely as American rebels used the flintlock. Think of the kinds of competitive advantage it will give you in the Indian business environment if you have at least an elementary knowledge of events like these, which hold a significance in the consciousness of the average Indian business person and professional at least as powerful as our American ideas of independence and self-sufficiency arising from our own American Revolution 200 years ago, and how strongly they affect the average American business person even today.
One theme that we found runs through a lot of the thinking in doing business in India is a theme of independence and self-reliance. And this is part of the great vision of Nehru when India was first independent in the late 1940s, to make an independent nation. And India set off to create a whole bunch of industry on their own and to build it from the ground up. And they made some quite remarkable strides in that. That was coupled with a socialist vision of taking care of all the people in India, and I think that just recently the nation has come to realize that that's not a practical vision to realize, and they're moving towards more of a free market economy. But that movement is slow, and it's in the context of decades as an independent nation with this vision of trying to do it all themselves, build their own telephone systems, build their own power systems. Part of that vision is the sense that they don't have time or money for luxuries. India is a poor nation. You'll hear people tell you that. And that has been true. And so consumer goods are almost viewed negatively. Certainly, if you look at the export laws, there are huge import duties and so on consumer goods, and the consumer industry hasn't been encouraged within the country. That also is changing, and some of the duties are coming down, and also more and more companies are making consumer goods in India. You see this in that you won't see brand names that you recognize by and large because India has encouraged their own brands. So soap and toothpaste and electronics and so on, you will see mostly Indian brand names.
When the British began their early trade agreements, the Mughal Empire controlled most of what is now northern and central India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The story of how British colonial rule came to pass is a complex one, but much of it began through simple trade agreements between various parts of India and the privately owned East India Company in the 1600s. When generations later it became clear that this trade was very much in the interest of England, the British government and the royal family got involved, and the British military was used to add India as the crown jewel of the British Empire. The Islamic Mughal dynasty lasted from 1526 through the mid-19th century, with a succession of 17 rulers, each of which left significant legends as well as architectural legacies. At the same time, much of India was divided into princely kingdoms controlled by individual Hindu rajas or Muslim princes who lived in opulent surroundings. Many of these rulers retained local power through the period of British colonialism, since it was the British style to establish their colonial rule through locally accepted authority and to educate the elite youth to become more British than British. Thus began the period of the British Raj, a style of life fictionalized so romantically in hundreds of novels. But the British were by no means the first outsiders to impose themselves on India. Though India is a complex, pluralistic society in which groups from various religions have lived together for centuries, as we've said, Hindus are by far the dominant group and should be the first group which you become familiar with when examining the India marketplace for opportunity and strategy.
With the end of the Raj, or the royal period, if you will, in India in 47, India went through a socialist revolution. They had been used and abused by the British. And it became a period of India for Indians and damn the outsiders. And under this socialist period, which really endured for about the next 40 years until 87 or 88, India was essentially a closed society. Automobiles were fixed in time. They all looked the same. Licenses were granted to Indian companies and not to outsiders. Outsiders were verboten. Investment was forbidden. They would pirate the technology, where it was pharmaceuticals or anything else, but for Indians only. In 87, 88, they began to recognize that this isolation from the world had a price far beyond what they had expected. And India began the process of opening up.
Traditional Indian society is well defined and hierarchical, based on a complex system of marriage within the group. Assignment to your group or caste is determined by birth or kinship, and you can't achieve the status of a higher caste person through performance of good deeds or appropriate work. Good deeds are expected from everyone according to the position in life to which he or she has been born. The Indian caste system is derived from the teaching of the Vedas and the Upanishads, holy scriptures which have been handed down in classical Sanskrit from generation to generation since approximately 1500 BC, which makes them among the most ancient written works in the world. In this caste system, there are four major varnas, or divisions. The Brahmin are the priestly caste. The other castes are the warrior kings, the merchants, and the artisans and farmers. Within each of these classes, or varnas, there are subcastes and other groupings that are important even today in much of India, and which determine appropriate marriage partners, for instance. Technically, anyone who's not a member of the upper four varnas is what's called an untouchable, and this is a much misunderstood aspect of Indian culture. Traditionally, relationships between members of different castes were forbidden in almost all areas of life, not just for marriage. Members of the different varnas, or castes, interacted in often very restricted ways. Failure to interact properly resulted in pollution, which then required performing elaborate and costly rituals of purification. Who you could interact with and how you could interact was traditionally determined by your circumstances at birth, and not by anything you could do later in life. Intermarriage between castes for the most of Indian history was strictly forbidden, as was almost any kind of physical contact. For example, contact with food prepared by someone of lower caste was prohibited for the upper castes. The Brahmins, for instance, would only eat certain foods which were to be prepared only by other Brahmins and were to be eaten only with other Brahmins. Needless to say, in today's modern business world in India, such traditional behaviors don't surface often. But contemporary Indians with a good perspective on their own culture see deeply ingrained attitudes about class and caste lying behind subtle aspects of who does business with whom and what kind of business is even possible between organizations of people from significantly different caste backgrounds, especially within the Indian business sectors where family-owned businesses predominate.
The Indians take a different view towards relationships than Americans. We generally have a short-term view of business relationships, and we appreciate that in each other. We tend to build relationships with people for as long as we need them, and then we sort of let them lapse when we no longer need them. And that's good on both sides, because when we're not actively working with somebody, then we appreciate their efficient use of our time by not bothering us when we don't have something business related. In India, it's very different. The relationship sort of comes first and needs to be sustained over a long period of time. And to the extent that you can invest in and build that relationship, it really becomes an asset. But it's an asset that must be nurtured over time without a specific business purpose. Now, if you're a big multinational corporation that's willing to go spend a number of years working on this, then you can afford to do that. And if you have a long-range plan, that's good. But if you're a small business person, that's more difficult. And so then an alternative is to find somebody who has an established network of relationships. You focus your attention on building the relationship with that person and then leveraging their other relationships. This doesn't change the rules for your relationship with that person, or maybe with a few other key selected people that you need to work with in India. You still need to invest in that relationship over the long term. Call them even when you don't have a business purpose. Write to them. Keep in touch, basically. But by doing that carefully with just one person and by picking the right person, then that person can use their contacts and their relationships to help you with your business.
In traditional relationships, those of higher caste expected those of lower caste to perform services for them. But this had to be done in such a way that the higher caste persons weren't contaminated or polluted by contact with the lower caste persons. Now, this means contamination in a ritual sense, although it's also the case that traditionally the lowest caste people were responsible for the dirtiest jobs, which naturally made them unclean from the perspective of the upper classes. This kind of rationalization should sound familiar to anyone who's been paying close attention to American society for the past 50 years or so. The harshness of the contrast between the lives of upper and lower caste persons was relieved somewhat by a belief in reincarnation, such that those of the lower caste believed that by living a good life, they could be reborn in the next life as a person of a higher caste, though their status in this life was unchangeable. Living a good life according to the laws of Hindu society meant that their spiritual being would be enhanced in this life. India is today a democratic society in which discrimination according to caste or religion is illegal. In some schools and in the civil service, there's a kind of an affirmative action in which what are called scheduled castes, those that have been traditionally discriminated against and which are listed on a government schedule, are given preference or minimum quotas for educational and occupational opportunities. Though the caste system's been officially abolished, most people are very aware of the caste rank of other people, and this caste rank is often signified by the surname. However, there's still a basic orientation within society toward hierarchy and stratification. This is true within families as well as within organizations or institutions. The person at the top of an Indian organization or family is fully in charge and is to be deferred to. There's always a strict chain of command, so to speak, all the way down the line. People tend to have a kind of social niche, which it is well understood how they are to behave toward others. Now, to Westerners, and especially Americans, this system seems very constrained and artificial. But for many Indians, it's a situation which doesn't provoke much anxiety. There's no requirement to figure things out. You know where people stand. Individuals may not have as many opportunities for individual decision-making, but then they also don't have to feel the great weight of total responsibility for making those decisions.